Jesus knew some Greek. Now, whether he spoke Greek or not, this is great controversy. Most people believe that he did, because he was able to talk to crowds here and crowds there, and some of those crowds he spoke to in Aramaic, and some of those crowds I'm sure he spoke to in Greek. I don't believe he used much Hebrew, because Hebrew by the time of Jesus is virtually a dead language. Did you know that?
No.
Hardly anybody is speaking Hebrew by the time you get to Jesus. They're speaking either Greek or Aramaic in the Holy Land. But over in Alexandria, they're all speaking Koine Greek. Now this is huge, right? This is really, really important. Now, so Alexander, of course, the Great dies. His kingdom is divided up. But the most important, the one that everybody wanted was Egypt, because it produced so much wealth through agriculture. Huge wealth, not to mention gold and some other things. So it was the very thing the Romans were after, and eventually the Romans take it over around the time of Christ. In fact, it's so easy to remember this because the first Roman emperor, remember, after Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Romans fight among themselves, and the guy that come to the top was named Octavian. And Octavian did a very important thing. Whether it's was a good or a bad thing, you'll have to ask history about that. But he decided to create a new category called emperor. Now, emperor then was not a king. It's very important, not a king. They hated kings. The Romans did. But he's also not chosen by the people through the Senate. He is just there by virtue of power. And so after Octavian, all of the emperors after him come to power through force, through a coup d'etat. And down to the end of the Roman period. Now, Octavian renamed himself. He had some blood connection to Julius Caesar, but Caesar wasn't his name, so he renamed himself Caesar Augustus. In other words, August meaning the grandest, if you will. The grandest of all the Caesars, Caesar Augustus. So a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. And it was in that Roman that when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and among those were Joseph and Mary, and they went to the city of Bethlehem because he was of the house and lineage of David. And it came forth that she brought forth her firstborn son and laid him in a manger and wrapped him in swaddling clothes. You see, in other words, the first emperor is alive, and the one who's causing them to be in Bethlehem in the first place. So it's very easy to date Christianity. The Roman Empire and Christianity start about the same time. And that's really an important kind of way of looking at it. So Alexandria continues as a great city under the Romans too. Now, the Greeks, of course, had certain cultural institutions that they built. The most important is the Alexandria Museum. And the word museum is a very interesting word because, of course, it means the temple of the muse. But there were 7 muses, so which one? And so the idea was all the muses. So you have a muse for art, a muse for music, and so on. All the muses would be there represented. And it's where you collected things and where you study things. So museum, to their eyes, would look to us, to our eyes, more like a university. Place where people come and talk and collect. And the heart of the museum, of course, was the famous Alexandrian library. Now, the Alexandrian Library is one of those places that started out modest and then became this enormously important place. And that Alexandrian Library was the idea the Greeks had, and then the Romans really were able to institute it, is you collect all the knowledge of the world, and you, or copies at least of that knowledge, and you bring it, put it in one place. So this became the great repository of knowledge. So people came from all over the Roman world they wanted to study something or learn about something, they would come and spend time at the library in Alexandria. Now, this, if nothing else, this is an enormous contribution, because every library in the world is a little teeny model of the Alexandrian Library. Although I have to say the Library of Congress is probably 1,000,000 times bigger in size, but the concept's the same. You know, collect. If you go to the Library of Congress today, I mean, they collect not just stuff from America, but they collect from everywhere, right? So scholars come from Poland and from Czechoslovakia, and they come from here and there to study their own culture, because certain documents only exist at the Library of Congress. And you know, at the Library of Congress, what most Americans do not realize is, if they know anything about library, you know, this idea if a book is published in the United States by law, a copy has to be sent to the Library of Congress. Well, there's a lot of books published that aren't sent, actually, because there's so many, you know, minor books, small publishers and all that kind of thing, but all the major publishers basically today still do this. So they send everything there, and then when recording started, same thing. And the Library of Congress just has all this stuff. So they have, most people are only familiar with one building next to the Supreme Court called the Thomas Jefferson Building. But they have two other huge buildings on Capitol Hill, and then out in Virginia, they've got all kinds of stuff they collect endlessly. And in a lot of ways, they compete with the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian, the other great museum, if you want to look at it that way, they collect physical objects, right? Everything, just about everything other than written. But the written word, nowadays the digital word, if you will, is what the Library of Congress collects. Thomas Jefferson started the Library of Congress by selling his collection to the Library of Congress. He would have given it, but he needed the money. But he gave him such a great price. It was like, you know, pennies on the dollar. And so that after the War of 1812, you know, all the books had been burned up in the Library of Congress, Thomas Jefferson then started it. And really, it's the core, to this day, it's the core of the Library of Congress. So there was a man there some years ago in Rare Books who decided, his name was Mark Divination, he decided to collect all the Thomas Jefferson books in one place. Before that, you know, they're where they belong in the library. So he got to when they realized there were many books missing. So they went out all over the world and they would find the book, because they had, you know, Jefferson kept immaculate lists. They knew every book that he owned. And they would go try to find the book somewhere. A lot of books they found in London and Paris and so on. And they would buy a first edition, I mean, the exact edition that Jefferson had, if they could find it. In other words, it wasn't the book Jefferson had, that one had burned up because there was another fire that burned a lot of the books. But they found most of them. There are only a few that they haven't found. Anyway, what's amazing, they set up in a room this thing that goes around, and all the Jefferson books are in it. Now what's stunning is you can check them out. Now this is amazing. So I thought, I'll give this a try. So I check out, you know, when you get there, you get a reader's card. And so I went and picked up, you know, you have to, it takes a while. They go get it, pull it out, and they come and hand it to you. You sit at the desk. And I'm looking through it and I see these notes. Now their notes are so small that even with my trifocals, I couldn't read, you know, that small print. It was just teeny. That's Jefferson in his own hand writing notes in the margin. Think about it. So I'm holding the book that Jefferson held, which is pretty, you know, pretty impressive, but not as impressive what happened to me. Several of you have heard this story before, but this happened to me in 2008.
Oh,
You have a call, Colin, would you like to answer it?
no, strangle it.
Like the strangling. Oh, it's your good old friend Terry King.
Yeah, that figures.
Yeah, there's a lot of friends. Okay, we're back in business.
Thank you, Nita.
There we go. Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's something else. So, I've been director for several National Endowment for the Humanities conferences and institutes in Washington, D.C. Most of these are at the Library of Congress. And now she left you a message, and you have to zap that out of there. And so I would take the students, I say students, really they're all professors from all over the country, and some of us would get in a van because they wanted to study at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, right next to Fenway Park, right? And so I've been down there a number of times, and so, you know, I was kind of like not particularly doing anything, and I didn't, you know, I guess I looked bored. So the staff members at the Massachusetts Historical Society decided to play a trick on me. Now this is the most unbelievable trick in the world, but it happened, and that was this. So they, one of the curators, very high up, named Peter Drummond, was pushing a cart along. He was pushing a cart along, and he came where I was standing, you know, waiting, kind of bored, and he could tell it. And he said, "Well, are you just waiting for those people?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I know nothing, you know, more boring than wait for somebody. And you, in your case, you're gonna wait for a whole bunch of people." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Maybe I've got something here you can just read while we're waiting. Are you waiting here?" And so he starts kind of fumbling through the stuff on the card. And he said, "I think it's here. Maybe I lost it."
Oh,
"No,
my God.
it's here." So he pulls out this document finally and hands it to me like you hand somebody a piece of gum, chewing gum. And so I thought, I wonder what this is. So I look at it, beautifully written, and it says, I started just reading the line. "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." I said, that's got to be Declaration of Independence. And he said, and then I said, before he would say anything, I said, "My, it's a beautiful copy. I mean, it doesn't look like it's, you know, reproduced at all." And then he said, "That's because it's not a copy." Wait a minute. You just told me, and I'm holding the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. Yes, sir, you are. Wait a minute, that's down in the National Archive. They have this thick glass. People stare through and look at it. He said, No. That's the printed copy, the one they signed. But this is actual, unedited Declaration of Independence by Jefferson. Now, here's what Jefferson had done. July 4th, you'll remember, it was the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence was read in the, what do they call it? In Philadelphia, they call it Continental Congress. It was read before the Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress then later that day voted on it. And that's why, by the way, it's July 4th. People go, why do we celebrate that day? Well, it's because that's the day they voted for the Constitution. They hadn't signed it that day. Only John Hancock, the only one that signed it originally. But that was the Constitution. But what happened is Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, had given it to Adams and Franklin, copies of Adams and Franklin, and they had taken out certain things. One thing Jefferson wanted to end was the slave trade. They got rid of that. He was livid. So he sat down, and he found that out. He sat down, and from memory, he wrote out in his perfect professional. Jefferson had two hands. One was his professional hand, one was his personal hand. And his professional, it looked like a machine, perfectly written. And he wrote out the Declaration of Independence, and he made 3 copies. One for himself, one for Adams, one for Franklin, and one for himself. Well, the Adams papers, of course, are in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And he just went and got that little sucker, pulled it out, and handed it to me. And I was holding Jefferson's original and perfect copy of Jefferson's version of the Declaration of Independence.
Were those done with quills or?
Yeah, he had quills. He had
Wow.
quills and ink. They haven't advanced yet on that front. They were doing the same things basically the Romans. Go all the way back to the Egyptians. They're still doing, take quill and because quills work real well. You dip the ink, you carry this little ink well with you all the time. And so Jefferson, first of all, for me, that was like one of those earth-shaking. I almost trembling, realizing what I was holding in my hand. And they all got a big laugh out of it, but I loved it because it was such a overwhelming and powerful thing to hold that in your hand, right? And to get a little bit closer to Jefferson in that way. So on at least 2 occasions, I've had his actual handwriting in my hand. And that's, of course, a great honor. But I do want to talk to you just as we try to wrap this up. We always run out of time as we have today. I just want to mention a couple of things. Think of Alexandria as the Silicon Valley of that time. I want to mention 2 inventions and then one building. The 2 inventions are the steam engine. The steam engine was invented in Alexandria by a man named Hero, H-E-R-O, Hero. And Hero not only invented it, but he wrote it all out. And so they still have the copies of this invented steam engine. The problem is, the Romans didn't have the technology, the metallurgy, to take the steam and connect it to something, like a wheel, right? You have to go all the way to the 1800s, or late 1700s, in order for that to happen. But they had the concept. One thing they invented that's so important to many people, and that is the organ. The first organ they invented, instead of using air, it used water, but it wasn't very long that they converted over into using air. And so if you ask somebody, where was the first organ in the whole world, they'd say Germany, right? England maybe, France, all those great organs. No. Alexandria, Egypt, for goodness, right? It's amazing, right? Then the other thing, of course, the great building they built, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the lighthouse at Alexandria. Now, unfortunately, we don't know much about it. We don't know what made it so great. One thing probably, they probably figured a way to get gas up there to light it up and mirrors so that they could see it way out in the ocean. There were a number of inventions, large and small, and technological adaptations that came out of Alexandria. Because basically, what Egypt became was a Greek place. It was, Greeks were there in great numbers. And they, some of Galen, for example, studied medicine. Galen is the guy who follows Hippocrates. Galen was in Alexandria studying medicine from the ancient Egyptians. So, see, Alexandria is a transfer point for ancient wisdom of Egypt to the Greek culture. And there's a lot of it, and you see a lot of ancient Egyptian wisdom coming through the Masonic traditions. Now, since we went way out of time, I'll just open up for just a minute or two. If anybody has a question or comment on Alexandria, anything you'd like to ask about?
I've just got one comment. One of the things I always tell people about your talks that I personally really enjoy is the way you give us all of the sources of the various words.
Yeah.
And you started off in spades today, so hey, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I love to do that. It is time consuming, but it's also in a lot of ways very important because a person will listen to a talk and they'll not, because they don't understand one word, they'll miss a whole section of the talk because they don't get one word. I had my epiphany one time when I was giving a lecture and a student, little girl in the back row, raised her hand. I had just talked about something that happened way back in 821 BC. And so she raised her hand and said, keep talking about BC. What's BC? Okay. She got to college without knowing what BC is. And I realized that you have to, even with pretty sophisticated audiences, you have to go and drill down at certain points on particular words and concepts, like the Septuagint. See, a lot of people just talk about the Septuagint like everybody knew about the Septuagint. But actually, most lay people don't know what the Septuagint is. That's the kind of thing you learn in seminary. So, yes.
Oh, I was saying, when you were in there, did they give you gloves, or did
No,
you just,
no.
because a lot of places you see people have to put on
Yeah,
gloves. to
both
touch
the Library of Congress and many museums believe that the gloves are a bigger problem than they are. Because, there's, the old issue of oil, right? But there's problems with gloves. And so gloves are used for certain things. But for general, for books and documents, unless there's something, very fragile, like maybe papyrus, but even then, the glove isn't necessarily going to help you on that either. The thing about it, if you have your fingers, you have more control than with gloves, because you kind of lose the touch part of it. Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
Oh, how did the empire, Alexander's empire, dissolve, or what?
So what happened is that the Romans, one by one, defeated the elements. Alexander Empire divided up into three parts, and they just systematically defeated. But actually, the Romans didn't take Egypt until they defeated Cleopatra and her husband, Mark Antony. And if they had won that battle, then he would have become the Roman emperor. And it would have been, instead of saying Caesar Augustus, it would say something else. It would have been Mark Antony.
Yeah.
And a decree went out from Mark Antony that all the world should be Mark. Yeah, from here.
Is it possible when Alexander defeated the Persians and Persepolis that he had transferred or taken any sort of literature from Persia and sort of stored that?
Yeah, he was all for doing that. In other words, he had been trained by Aristotle. And this is the thing, last week we ended with Aristotle, and this week we end with Aristotle. Because Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, and he said, whatever you do, go out and collect things. Now, he was more interested in natural fauna flora, plants, not as much as animals. But Alexander took it very broadly, so he had a lot of things sent back to Aristotle. And that seems to me really important, this concept of collecting, see? And that's what the museum and the library were all about. Yeah, okay, well, we run out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
You know, the museum in